Hi, I'm David Kinane from Banter Speech and Language, and today we're going to be talking about idioms. Obviously, the first question is, what is an idiom? Well, here we go. Idioms are phrases like skating on thin ice or kicking the bucket that have got fixed meanings, and they're figurative meanings too. The word idiom actually comes from the ancient Greek meaning private property. And one of the interesting things about idioms is that idiom is itself an idiom. Some people think that idioms are the most frequently used form of figurative language. And when we are talking about the word figuratively, here we mean that the word is not necessarily related, at least not directly, with the literal meaning of the words, just like our skating on thin ice example before. Figurative language, of course, is much wider than idioms. It includes things like metaphors and similes and proverbs, and sometimes there's debate about what's an idiom, what's a proverb, and what's a saying. And for me, idioms are phrases. They're not full sentences. They don't necessarily have a moral or a meaning to them, and they're usually fixed. They're the ways that I usually tell the difference between, say, a simple idiom like skating on thin ice and an Aesop's fable or a more formal saying like the early bird gets the worm and things like that. Now, some idioms are known pretty much internationally, but lots of them are specific to a given culture, and some of them are even very specific or even more specific to a particular environment or a place. So, why are idioms important? Now, this is a question I get asked a lot, and I want to go into it in a bit of detail today. So, the reality is that idioms occur very frequently, particularly in spoken English, but also in written language, including the language that's used in the classroom. Researchers tell us that for teenagers, there's a positive relationship between idiom comprehension and academic achievement. Now, that's just a correlation. It's not necessarily a causation relationship there, but it's well worth noting anyway, that people who are generally good at academic achievement usually have a pretty good grasp on idioms as well. So we know that students with developmental language disorders, and that's about 7% of all students, often have difficulties understanding what idioms mean. We also know that students with significant reading difficulties also tend to have real problems with idioms generally. So when do we learn them? How do they magically go from the page or listening to other people speaking to things that we know and can understand in conversation? Well, most people think that we learn idioms starting at around the age of 5, 6, 7 or 8, but we continue to learn them right through to adolescence and indeed into middle age. In fact, my kids are constantly teaching me new idioms, much to their horror. Some students obviously have more exposure to idioms, particularly if they watch a lot of media or if they read a lot of books or in daily interactions with adults and their peers. And we know that some kids start school and in fact go into middle school without really having much of a grasp on idioms at all. We know that about 6% of sentences in third grade books contain an idiom, and this increases to 10% by year 8. And we know that by year 8, almost 1 in 5 teachers' utterances contain idioms, which is a lot, isn't it? Now, some idioms are trickier than others. Some can be worked out by imagining them literally. For example, if we use the example we've been using all the way through so far, skating on thin ice, if you kind of imagine yourself doing that, you might know that it means that you've put yourself in a risky situation. But of course, that assumes that you've either experienced thin ice yourself, so you know what it's like, not something that many Australians have experienced actually, or you've seen films or YouTube clips that sort of show you people falling through the ice. When I think of it, I always think of the end of the Fargo TV series, for example, or they've read a lot about it. And we call these idioms transparent idioms in the sense that we can figure out what they mean from their meaning, or from their literal words, or by imagining ourselves applying literal words literally. Other idioms just can't be worked out this way. For example, if you're learning English as a second language, how are you going to figure out that kicking the bucket means that you're going to die? Putting yourself or imagining yourself kicking a bucket doesn't naturally lead you to that conclusion, and it's something that you just have to learn. And because the meaning of these idioms are hidden, we sometimes call these opaque idioms. Now, logically, you'd think that transparent idioms were easier to learn than opaque idioms. But interestingly, the research doesn't show that consistently, which is kind of really, I guess, counterintuitive. So, how do we learn idioms? Well, we don't know for sure. Like many things in the science of language, we just don't know. There are certainly lots of theories out there, and two of the main ones are that we learn an idiom almost like we learn a new word. In other words, we kind of learn the whole phrase as kind of a new word, if you like. And the second way is that we learn idioms by analysing their individual words or other individual parts, like our skating on thin ice example just before. We know that some things contribute to being able to understand idioms. Obviously, having a lot of background knowledge about the world and how it works plays a big part in understanding some idioms. And again, if you are on the edge of a lake that gets frozen and you've got deep knowledge of how ice forms over lakes and defrosts in summer, then you're going to have an easier time understanding the thin ice example or the skating on thin ice example than somebody who lives in a desert and has perhaps never actually experienced snow or water freezing naturally like that. Some researchers think that there's a relationship to theory of mind development. If you want to have a look at what I mean by theory of mind development in more detail, be sure to check out the Theory of Mind blog on our website. Just type that into the search box and it should pop straight up. And of course, probably the biggest contributor to idiom learning is exposure. And that means hearing and reading an idiom several times in different contexts to figure out its meaning. And for many of us, we pick idioms up that way by hearing them being used by parents, reading them in books, hearing them on TV, and eventually, over time, we kind of just deduce what their meaning is. But not for everyone. Context certainly matters with idioms. So books, I remember certainly one of the places that I learned a lot of my idioms was my second grade teacher. Now, he had a particular love for Greek mythology and Roman mythology and Norse mythology, and sharing lots of stories, sharing myths and legends and fables, first of all, instilled a great interest in those topics for myself, which was great. But secondly, exposed me to the origin of lots of the idioms that we take for granted. And we're going to be looking at a couple of examples of those that are still come to mind when I think all the way back to year 2. Obviously, hearing them in sentences, hearing examples and non-examples, hearing stories, helps us to put idioms into context, and particularly those stories that sort of demonstrate the idiom in action can really help. And they don't need to be very long. They can just be a couple of sentences long, and some of us are going to pick them up. But for some children with communication disorders, in particular developmental language disorders, they're not going to pick up idioms from the environment just by hearing or reading them, just like with some typically developing kids. And some students are going to need extra help to understand idioms. That means that some children are going to be taught idioms directly and explicitly, and some are going to be needed to be given lots of extra context, lots of extra examples and things like visual support to really help them get to the bottom of what these strange phrases mean. And we shouldn't assume that that's easy for all of us. So that brings us to the next question. Which idioms should we teach our kids? Great question. One that I've been looking for an answer to for a long time. And the answer is there is no answer. It varies from culture to culture, and there's no set list. When I'm choosing idioms to teach my students, I always start with idioms that they're likely to hear frequently at school and in the local community. And I'm also going to try to bring idioms alive by choosing those that come to us through classic stories and myths and legends and proverbs and fables, and sayings that are commonly referenced and used in books and in media, in everything from Simpsons episodes right through to academic texts. I'm looking for things that they're going to hear in a lot of different places. Nippold and Rosinski, way back in 1993, came up with a really great list of idioms. Now, I've put them up here. I'm not going to read them all. But what they did is they actually sorted them in order of how easy they were or how commonly they were understood by school-age children. And here I've arbitrarily divided them into simple, trickier, and complex. But basically, they're in order from really simple to much more complicated. And this is a list, I guess, that's been used in lots of research over the years, and also in lots of teaching of kids' idioms. I tend to use this as a really helpful list when I'm trying to think about idioms to use. As I mentioned before, using idioms from Greek mythology and legends is an incredibly useful thing to do. Here are just 8 that occurred to me as I was putting these slides together. You can probably think of a lot more. But and the best thing about these is that each of them is a story. Each of them is something that you can bring to life by going back to the Greek myth from which the idiom came and retelling it to your students or to your children. And I find that that's one of the best ways for kids, including kids with communication disorders, to try to figure out what these strange phrases mean. And lastly, I thought I'd just share with you some idioms that I've caught myself using with the kids during the school holidays. Some of them are tired old cliches that the kids roll their eyes about. Others are kind of a bit more interesting. I actually didn't realize that I used as many as this until I actually tracked myself over the last week. And I'm sure if I kept doing it, many more would pop up as I was saying it. So, you might find that going through the same exercise yourself leads you to discover that you're using a lot of idioms, including teachers in classes that you may not have explicitly or directly taught or explained. And if you do find that, don't be embarrassed about it. Use it as an opportunity to kind of try to bring the idiom to life for your students. So, what's the bottom line? Well, it's not going to come as a surprise. As a speech-language pathologist, I think that idioms should be included in language development programs. Even for young kids, it's never too early to start idiom teaching, if you like. And I often find a really great way to do that is with things like fairy stories and Aesop's fables. If you're looking for a list of those, be sure to check out our audiobooks for preschoolers and young school-age children and middle school-age children and older school-age children. Many of them have great idioms used in them, and it's a perfect way to teach them. Students with developmental language disorders and reading comprehension difficulties may not pick up on the meaning of idioms. Obviously, with developmental language disorders, it's the language disorder that gets in the way. For reading comprehension, it might be difficulties decoding or getting the words off the page. Or it might be language issues themselves. You may not have read as much as some kids who don't have reading difficulties and therefore won't have been exposed to idioms as often as typically developing kids. And these students might need a little bit of help. So students with developmental language disorders and significant reading comprehension difficulties are obviously going to need to be exposed to the idioms and their figurative meanings. They might need lots of exposure. So you might need to explain it many times over a long period for these kids to pick it up. Obviously, as I said before, you want to teach the idioms directly and explicitly, recognizing that not all kids are going to be able to hear the idiom and work it out from its context. Lots of my students benefit from visual cues, so pulling up some images to accompany the idioms. That's very easy when you're working with those that come to us from famous myths and legends and stories. But you can get creative, and it's interesting to me how many idioms you can find depicted in simple pictures just by looking at Google Images or something like that. And finally, we should be teaching these kids not just individual idioms, but the way, the mental model that we apply or the process we use to figure out how to actually work out idioms from context. That way, we're kind of teaching the underlying skill so that these students, when they encounter another idiom that they haven't heard before, and there are thousands of idioms out there, that they have an approach that they can use to try, like a detective, to crack the code, to try to figure out what the idiom means in its context. So that's it. I hope you found that useful. I've cited, I guess, the main things that I read here, and I can't recommend these articles on the left enough, particularly the Norbury article and the Nippold and Rosinsky list that I mentioned, and the fantastic doctoral dissertation that I found from Kay, which went into a lot of detail and was really practical in terms of the principles we should use when we're trying to help kids with and without language difficulties to learn idioms. I'm David Kinane. This is a banter speech and language video blog. I hope you found it useful. Bye-bye.